It was December 26th, 1900, when I first set foot on the cold, windswept rock of Eilean Moor, part of the remote Flannan Isles. The sea churned with an unnatural violence that morning, though the sky was a clear, empty gray. Our ship, the Hesperus, had battled strong winds for hours before we reached the island, and the moment we approached, something in the air felt wrong. I was part of the relief crew, sent to replace the 3 lighthouse keepers who had been stationed here for weeks. It was a routine exchange, one that had been delayed due to severe storms. But as we drew closer to the dock, I felt a deep unease. The lighthouse stood tall and motionless on the rocky cliffside, its lantern room silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. No one was waiting at the landing to greet us. Captain Harvey, standing at the bow, muttered under his breath. They should be here. Even if the storm delayed them, they would have seen us coming. Normally, one of the keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, or Donald MacArthur, would have been at the landing dock, signaling to us. Yet the island was as silent as a graveyard. Joseph Moore, the assistant lighthouse keeper who was to take over duty, paled. "Something's wrong," he said, voice barely above a whisper. We docked uneasily. I was among the first to disembark, along with Moore and 2 others. The wind bit into our faces as we climbed the steep, stone-cut path toward the lighthouse. The silence, I noticed, wasn't just a lack of human voices, it was an absence of anything. No birds, no waves crashing against the rocks, no whisper of wind through the grass. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. When we reached the lighthouse, Moore stepped forward, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and pushed it open. It creaked loudly in protest. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of old oil and damp stone. The first thing I noticed was the clock on the wall. It had stopped, its hands frozen in place. That sent a chill through me. The kitchen table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. Plates were out, chairs slightly pulled back, as if the men had been interrupted mid-meal. The fireplace was cold, the ashes long dead. I ran a hand over the table's surface. Dustless. They hadn't been gone long. Moore went ahead, checking the bedrooms. The beds were unmade, blankets tossed aside as if the men had left in a hurry. Their oilskins, heavy weather gear, were missing except for one. That was the first truly disturbing detail. One of them had left the lighthouse in normal clothes, despite the brutal winds and freezing rain that had battered the island in recent days. We climbed to the top of the lighthouse. The lamp, crucial for guiding ships through these dangerous waters, had been extinguished. It should have been tended to every night without fail, yet here it was dark and useless. Descending, we searched the outbuildings, the supply shed, the storage room. Everything was in order, untouched. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. At last, we reached the western landing, where the storms had been the worst. And there, we found something. The iron railings along the edge of the cliff had been twisted and torn from their bolts. Rocks had been ripped from their places, scattered unnaturally. Ropes meant for securing equipment were shredded and tangled in the sea wind. The force needed to do such damage was unimaginable. A wave? A storm? I had seen violent seas before, but nothing like this. And still no bodies. No sign of the men. Moore knelt, examining the wreckage. They must have come down here to secure something. Maybe the storm took them. But all 3 of them? And why hadn't one stayed behind, as was protocol? Why had one of them gone out without his weather gear? We searched every inch of the island before darkness fell, but there was no sign of the keepers. They had vanished as if swallowed by the wind itself. That night, we remained in the lighthouse. None of us wanted to, but there was no choice. We lit the lamp, preparing it for use again, but the feeling of unease was impossible to shake. The rooms felt occupied despite their emptiness. The shadows seemed thicker, deeper. And the silence, God, the silence was unbearable. I struggled to sleep, my mind racing with theories. Had they been murdered? Had madness taken them? Had they fled? Or was there something else? Something lurking in the darkness of this forsaken rock? On the second day, we found the last clue. Moore had gone through the lighthouse logbook, and what he read made his face turn white. He shared the last few entries with us. December 12th, severe storms. Worse than anything we've seen. Waves crashing over the cliffs. Duckett silent. MacArthur crying. December 13th, the storm continues. All 3 of us praying. We are afraid. December 14th, storm passed. Sea calm. God is over all. And that was it. The storm they wrote about had raged days before their disappearance. but there had been no record of storms in the area at the time. And then there was the final line. God is over all. Did they know something? Did they see something? We left the island after 3 days, reporting our findings. The investigation concluded that a rogue wave had likely taken them, but I've never believed that. I don't think I ever will. Something happened on that island. Something unnatural. And the Flannan Isles will keep its secrets forever. I remember the day we moved into the farmhouse as if it happened yesterday. It was the winter of 1971, and the air was sharp with the scent of dry wood and the cold bite of an overcast sky. Our station wagon was packed to the roof with boxes, blankets, and little trinkets from our old home. My parents had spent years scraping together enough money to afford this place. A sprawling, centuries-old farmhouse on a patch of Rhode Island land that stretched farther than my young eyes could see. To them, it was a dream. To me, it soon became a nightmare. The house stood silent when we arrived, towering over us like an old sentinel. The paint on the wooden siding was cracked, the windows dark and sunken, and the wraparound porch sagged just slightly, as if the house itself were sighing under the weight of its own history. My mother, Carolyn, was the first to step onto the porch. She ran her fingers along the railings, smiling. "It's perfect," she murmured. My father, Roger, carried in the first box, grunting under the weight. My sisters and I, 5 of us in total, followed suit, eager to explore our new home. The moment I stepped inside, something shifted. The air was thick, stagnant in a way that didn't make sense for a house that had supposedly been vacant for some time. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath our weight, as if announcing our arrival to an unseen audience. Dust floated in the light streaming through the high windows, giving the entire space a hazy, muted look. My sisters, still caught up in the excitement of the move, ran up the stairs, their giggles echoing against the old wooden walls. Then, something caught my eye. At the far end of the hallway, near the old brick fireplace, a shadow shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just the subtlest movement, like the way heat ripples off pavement on a summer day. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I saw something standing there, something just beyond recognition. But when I blinked, the space was empty. I shook it off. I was just being jumpy. It was a new house, after all. New places always felt a little strange at first. That night, as we settled into our rooms, the house settled, too. The wind pushed against the old boards, making them creak and groan. The radiators hissed, filling the silence with soft, rhythmic sighs. I lay in bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, listening. There was a strange kind of energy to the place, something I couldn't put into words. It wasn't malevolent. Not yet. But it was there. Watching. The disturbances started small. Objects would disappear and reappear in odd places. My mother would set her sewing scissors on the kitchen counter, only to find them neatly placed in the drawer moments later. My father's boots, left by the door, would be found lined up perfectly at the foot of the stairs. The broom moved from room to room without anyone touching it. My younger sister, Cindy, woke up one morning convinced someone had been in our room while we slept. "I heard whispers," she insisted, like someone was standing right next to me. I wanted to brush it off, to tell her it was just the wind sneaking through the cracks in the old walls. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. One evening, while playing outside, I noticed my mother standing in the garden, staring at the house. Her face was tight, her arms wrapped around herself. I walked up beside her. "Mom." She didn't answer right away. She just kept staring. Then, in a low voice, she said, "Have you ever felt like someone's watching you?" I swallowed hard. "Sometimes." She nodded slowly. "Me too." That was the first time she admitted it. The first time she acknowledged that we weren't alone. It got worse. One night, my mother woke to the sound of shuffling in the hallway. She thought it was one of us getting up to use the bathroom, but when she checked, we were all sound asleep. Then she saw the door to the parlor swing open on its own. Another time, my father came inside from the barn, his face pale. "Did one of you girls move my tools?" he asked. We all shook our heads. He muttered something under his breath and walked back out, but I could tell he was rattled. And then there was the smell. Out of nowhere, an overwhelming stench of rotting meat would fill the house. It would vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving us gagging and confused. No matter how much my mother scrubbed, no matter how many candles she lit, the stench would always return. Then one night, I woke to the sound of my sister crying. Cindy was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "She's in the corner," she whispered. I turned my head slowly. At first, I saw nothing. Just the darkened outline of our wardrobe, the old rocking chair, the stack of folded blankets. But then a shadow. A darker patch of darkness, standing completely still. I couldn't breathe. We stayed like that, frozen, until Cindy let out a whimper. The moment she made a sound, the shadow shifted, like someone stepping forward. The blankets tangled around my legs as I scrambled for the lamp. When the light flicked on, the corner was empty. We slept with the lights on after that. My mother was the first to see her. She had been in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when she glanced toward the window. At first, she thought she was looking at her own reflection. But then the figure moved, and it wasn't her. It was an old woman, standing just outside the glass. She wore a tattered dress, her hair wild and unkempt. Her face was twisted in an expression of pure hatred. And then, just like that, she was gone. My mother backed away from the sink, her breath coming in short gasps. She ran to the back door, flung it open, and stepped outside. But there was nothing there, just the wind rustling through the trees. After that, the woman appeared more frequently, sometimes in reflections, sometimes at the edge of our vision, but always watching. The night my mother was attacked, we knew we had to leave. It started like all the other nights, whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched. But then a crash, a scream. We ran to my parents' room and found my mother on the floor, clutching her leg. She was sobbing. "She grabbed me," she choked out. "She grabbed me." There were bruises forming on her calf, long, dark fingerprints. That was the final straw. We packed up and left the next morning. Even after we left, the nightmares followed. The feeling of being watched never really went away. My mother would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she could still hear whispers. My sisters refused to talk about what happened. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that house. I don't know if it was something tied to the land, something lurking long before we arrived. But I do know one thing for certain. Some places remember. Some places never let go. And some houses, no matter how much time passes, will always watch. My name is Peggy Hodgson, and in the summer of 1977, I moved into a small house in Enfield, London, with my 4 children, Margaret, Janet, Johnny, and Billy. I was a single mother, doing my best to raise my kids on my own. The house was nothing special, just a typical council house on Green Street, but it was home. I never could have imagined that within days of settling in, we would experience something that would change our lives forever. At first, it was just small things. Items would go missing and turn up in places we hadn't left them. The television would switch channels on its own. I thought it was just the kids playing tricks or my mind playing games with me. But then, the noises started. It began with knocking. Always at night. Always just as I was settling in after putting the children to bed. A steady, rhythmic knocking coming from the walls. It seemed to move, one night from the ceiling, another from the door. I checked on the children, but they were fast asleep. I told myself it was just the old pipes in the house making noise. One night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. Rushing into Janet and Margaret's bedroom, I found their chest of drawers had moved from the wall to the middle of the room. The girls were sitting up in their beds, wide-eyed and terrified. "Mum, it moved by itself," Janet whispered, clutching her blanket. "Nonsense," I said, forcing a smile. It probably just wasn't stable. But as I reached out to push it back against the wall, I felt an ice-cold breeze sweep through the room. And then, right before my eyes, the chest of drawers slid forward again, on its own. I gasped, stepping back, my heart pounding. The girls screamed, and we all ran downstairs. That was the night I knew something was horribly wrong. Over the next few days, the activity worsened. Taps would turn on by themselves, doors would slam shut, and objects would fly across the room. I started keeping the children close to me at all times. They were scared, and so was I. One evening, I heard a voice. A deep, gravelly voice coming from Janet's room. When I walked in, I found her sitting up in bed, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her mouth moving. But the voice that came out of her did not belong to my daughter. "It's mine," the voice growled. I froze in the doorway. "Who are you?" I whispered. Janet's eyes rolled back, and the voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You don't belong here," it said. I slammed the door shut and ran to the phone. I didn't know who to call, but I needed help. I reached out to a neighbor, Vic Nottingham, a strong man who had always been kind to my family. He came over that night with his wife. We all sat in the living room, listening to the knocking sounds echo through the house. Vic, a skeptic, stomped his foot on the floor and shouted, "If someone's there, do that again." A moment of silence followed. Then, 3 loud knocks rang out, clear and deliberate. Vic turned pale. The next morning, I contacted the police. 2 officers arrived, and while they were speaking to me, a chair slid across the kitchen floor, on its own. One of the officers screamed, stepping back in shock. They searched the house but found nothing and left, saying there was nothing they could do. Desperate, I contacted the press. A reporter from the Daily Mirror came with a photographer. As soon as they set foot in the house, objects began flying through the air. One of their cameras was knocked over. The photographer took pictures, capturing what looked like floating furniture and shadowy figures. News of the haunting spread, catching the attention of paranormal investigators Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair from the Society for Psychical Research. They arrived with recording equipment and cameras, ready to document what was happening. Maurice sat with Janet, asking her questions. She was just an 11-year-old girl, but when she spoke, sometimes the deep, growling voice would take over. "My name is Bill," it rasped one night. Maurice leaned in. "Bill who?" "Bill Wilkins," the voice said. "I lived here before. I died in that chair downstairs." I felt my stomach drop. I had never heard of a Bill Wilkins before. But when we checked the history of the house, we discovered that an elderly man named Bill Wilkins had indeed lived here, and he had died of a brain hemorrhage in the very chair we still had in the corner of our living room. Things got worse after that. Janet was thrown across the room by an unseen force. Margaret would wake up with scratches on her arms. The voice grew angrier, shouting obscenities and laughing at us. At times, Janet would levitate off her bed, her body stiff and lifeless as if controlled by something else. Maurice and Guy recorded hundreds of hours of audio evidence. They witnessed Janet being lifted into the air, furniture moving on its own, and unexplained noises echoing through the house. One night, I awoke to find Janet standing in my doorway. Her eyes were empty, her mouth twisted into a smirk. "Get out," she said. It wasn't Janet's voice. It wasn't even the voice of the Bill entity. It was something else, something darker. I grabbed my daughter and shook her, screaming her name. She gasped, her eyes clearing, and collapsed into my arms, sobbing. That was the night I decided we couldn't stay any longer. We packed our bags and left, moving in with my mother. The house sat empty for months, but eventually, the activity died down. Janet later admitted that she sometimes exaggerated the events for attention, but she swore that most of it was real. And I believe her. Even years later, Janet said she could still feel something watching her. Even when we moved, she would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, feeling that something was still with her. I don't know what we encountered in that house, but I know one thing for certain: it was real. And it was terrifying. To this day, people argue whether the Enfield poltergeist was real or a hoax. But I lived through it, and I wouldn't wish that horror on anyone. The summer of 1916 had been unbearably hot, and the only relief we could find was at the beach. I had just turned 19 that June, a tall, lanky young man with a love for the ocean. My hometown of Matawan, New Jersey, wasn't far from the shore, and like most people, I took every opportunity to spend my afternoons by the water. The war in Europe was distant news, a thing that concerned politicians and newspapers, but not me. My world was sand between my toes, the rhythmic crashing of waves, and the occasional stolen glance at a pretty girl adjusting her sun hat. Life was simple, peaceful. That all changed on July 1st, the day the ocean turned against us. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard the details from a friend. A young man named Charles Van Sant, only a few years older than me, had arrived in Beach Haven with his family for the holiday weekend. He waded into the Atlantic in the late afternoon, laughing, his hands slicing through the warm water. His dog paddled beside him. Witnesses said Charles suddenly stopped moving, his face contorted in confusion before shifting to pain. Then he screamed. Those on shore saw the water around him darken as something large thrashed beneath him. It wasn't until lifeguards rushed in and dragged him to the beach that they realized what had happened. His leg was shredded, nearly severed, blood pouring onto the sand. He died in the hotel that night, his family helpless as doctors tried and failed to stop the bleeding. A shark, they said. A A shark had killed him. I remember laughing when I heard it. A shark. No one was afraid of sharks back then. They were creatures of myths and sailors' stories, beasts that lived in the deep ocean, not in the waters where we swam every day. Some people whispered that it must have been a sea turtle or maybe a barracuda, but no one truly believed a shark could do such a thing. Then it happened again. Only 5 days later, on July 6th, another man was attacked. Charles Bruder, a hotel bellhop, had gone for a swim during his break. It was a perfect day, bright sun, a calm sea, families laughing along the shore. And then came the scream. Women fainted as a dark stain spread across the water, bright red against the blue. Lifeguards rushed toward the sound, their boats cutting across the waves. When they reached Charles, they found him still conscious but barely clinging to life. Both of his legs were gone, torn away beneath the knees. He bled out before they even made it back to shore. Now, the newspapers were filled with terror. The Jersey Man-Eater, they called it. People abandoned the beaches. Fishing boats scoured the waters. Towns posted armed men along the shore, scanning the waves for any sign of a fin. But sharks are creatures of the sea, not of human fear. They do not care for our concerns, our weapons, or our panic. They move as they please, and this one was not finished. By July 12th, the panic had reached my town. The attacks had all happened at the shore, miles away from us. I still felt safe, as did most people in Mattawan. After all, we weren't on the coast. We lived near a tidal creek, a quiet, brackish waterway that wound through the woods, far from the crashing waves of the ocean. A group of us had planned to swim that afternoon. The heat was unbearable, and the water was always cool beneath the shade of the trees. My best friend Lester Stillwell, a skinny 11-year-old with a mischievous streak, led the way. A few other boys followed, laughing as they kicked up dust on the trail. I was the oldest of the group, nearly an adult, but I still joined in their games. We splashed into the creek without a second thought, the water wrapping around us like a cool embrace. It was peaceful, right until Lester screamed. At first, I thought he was joking. Then he was gone, yanked under as if some unseen hand had grabbed his ankle and pulled. The water around us turned red. The other boys scattered, thrashing toward shore. My heart pounded as I turned in circles, searching. For what, I didn't know. There were no waves, no fins, just the slow ripple of the creek, the soft rustling of trees, and the stain of blood drifting outward. Then Lester reappeared, but only for a second. His eyes were wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. And then he was dragged under again, his small hand vanishing beneath the murky water. I ran, not out of fear, but for help. The town was only a few minutes away, and I sprinted through the streets, gasping out words between heaving breaths. Lester, water, something help. Men grabbed rifles, axes, anything they could find. They followed me back to the creek, their faces set with grim determination. They waded into the water, peering down into its depths, the blood now fading into the muddy current. One of them, Stanley Fisher, dove beneath the surface. I held my breath. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Just as I began to think the worst, Stanley reappeared, gasping for air. In his arms was Lester's limp body. Relief flooded me, but only for a moment. The water behind Stanley rippled. Then something dark and massive lunged upward. Teeth flashed. Stanley screamed as the thing clamped onto his thigh. Blood poured into the creek as the men on shore fired their guns. The shark thrashed violently, refusing to release its hold. Finally, a lucky shot struck home, and the beast let go, disappearing into the depths. Stanley was dragged to shore, his legs shredded, his face pale. We rushed him to the doctor, but it was too late. He died a few hours later. Lester never woke up. The town was in shock. This was no accident, no unlucky encounter at the sea. This thing had come here, into our waters, our safe places. The hunt began immediately. Armed men patrolled the creek, boats lined the banks, and nets were dragged through the water. The fear in the town was like a living thing, thick in the air, clinging to every whispered conversation. A few days later, a fisherman named Michael Schleiser caught a great white shark off Raritan Bay. When they cut it open, they found human remains inside, bones, torn flesh, the last remnants of the victims. The killings stopped after that. The beaches reopened. Life returned to normal. But I never swam in those waters again. It has been years now, but I still see it when I close my eyes. The red-stained creek, Lester's terrified face, Stanley's screams. People have theories now, books written by men in clean offices, explaining why it happened. why the shark came so far inland, why it killed so many. Some say it was hunger, others say it was sickness, an unnatural madness. But I know the truth. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't madness. It was something far worse. It was curiosity. And that, more than anything, terrifies me. I remember the excitement mixed with desperation when we first moved into the house in Southington, Connecticut. It was the late 1980s, and my family was struggling. My son, Philip, had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and we needed to be closer to his hospital for treatment. Driving back and forth for hours was taking a toll on all of us. My husband, Alan, and I had been looking for a rental home near the hospital when we stumbled upon an old colonial-style house. The price was unbelievably low for such a large house, and the landlord seemed eager to have us move in as soon as possible. He didn't ask too many questions, and though the house needed a bit of work, we figured it was a perfect place to start over. I remember the way the house looked the first time I stepped inside. The tall ceilings, the heavy wooden doors, and the long, dimly lit hallways. It was eerily quiet, even though it was located in a residential area. At first, the house was nothing more than an old home with creaky floors and drafty windows. It had a strange atmosphere, but I brushed it off as nerves. We needed this house. We needed the stability. Then, we found the basement. It wasn't until we started unpacking that we discovered the house had a history. While exploring the basement, we found metal stretchers, embalming tables, and narrow drawers built into the walls. The realization hit me like a cold slap. This house had once been a funeral home. I tried to keep it to myself at first. The children didn't need to know. They had enough on their minds, especially Philip. But soon, the questions started coming. Why are there strange stains on the basement floor? My daughter asked. Why do the doors keep sticking? Why do I hear voices at night? I dismissed their worries, even when I started noticing things myself. The air in the house was thick, as if something unseen lingered in every room. I found myself waking up at odd hours, certain I had heard whispering. Objects seemed to move on their own, small things like a spoon placed on a counter ending up across the kitchen. The feeling of being watched became constant, but I convinced myself it was just stress. Then Philip changed. At first, I thought it was the medication. Philip was going through grueling cancer treatments, and the side effects were brutal. He became withdrawn, irritable, and he barely ate. But what disturbed me the most was the way he started talking about the house. He told me he saw shadows moving in the hallways, shifting figures in the corners of his vision that vanished when he turned his head. He whispered about a man in the basement, a tall figure with hollow eyes. His nightmares grew worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of Philip screaming. I rushed to his room, my heart pounding. He was standing in the middle of his bed, staring at the wall. His body was rigid, his face contorted in terror. "There's someone in the room," he whispered. I turned on the light, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. I pulled him into my arms, trying to calm him, but I couldn't ignore the way my own skin prickled, as if someone unseen was watching us. Then, the real horror began. The activity in the house grew more violent. Shadows no longer lurked in the corners. They moved freely, slipping across the walls like living things. My daughter began sleepwalking, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips moving as if she were whispering to someone unseen. The worst of it was the basement. No one wanted to go down there anymore. The air was suffocating, the shadows too thick. Even in the daylight, it felt wrong. My husband, Alan, was a skeptic. He dismissed our fears until one night when he went down there alone. I heard him shout, followed by the sound of something crashing. I ran downstairs, finding him pale and shaken, standing next to an overturned chair. He started, then shook his head. Nothing. I must have tripped. But his hands were shaking. Philip's behavior became even more alarming. He spoke in a deep voice that wasn't his own, muttering words that made no sense. One night, he attacked his younger brother, pinning him down with an unnatural strength. We had to pull him off, his eyes glazed and unseeing. I knew something was deeply wrong. Desperate, I reached out for help. I contacted a priest, but he seemed reluctant to get involved. Then, I found the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators. When they arrived, Lorraine stepped into the house and immediately went pale. "There is something dark here," she whispered. They set up their equipment, spending days investigating the house. Lorraine claimed the spirits of those who had been prepared for burial in the funeral home still lingered. But worse, something inhuman had attached itself to Philip. The idea chilled me. That night, the activity escalated to a terrifying level. Doors slammed shut on their own. The temperature in the house plummeted. A horrible stench filled the air, like rotting flesh. Then Philip screamed. We found him in his room, his body contorted, his mouth open in a silent wail. Lorraine stepped forward, her voice firm as she began praying. The moment stretched unbearably, the very air seeming to vibrate. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The house was silent. Philip collapsed. We left the house soon after. There was no question, we couldn't stay. The landlord never spoke about the house's past, and we never pressed him. Philip recovered, though he never spoke about the things he saw. I sometimes wonder if he even remembers. Years later, I still think about that house. I wonder what lingers there, what unseen forces watched us from the shadows. I wonder if the next family who moves in will feel the same oppressive air, hear the same whispers. I hope, for their sake, they never have to experience what we did. I still remember the way the air smelled that night. Humid, thick with the scent of pine and freshly turned dirt. The sky above was clear, a silver moon casting its glow over the quiet, rural outskirts of Texarkana. The kind of night that made everything feel still, like the world was holding its breath. But it wasn't peaceful. Not for me. Not for anyone who had heard the whispers about the killer that stalked the roads outside town. They called him the Phantom, a shadow with no face, a hunter that emerged from the darkness to strike young couples parked along the lovers' lanes. The kind of places where the only sounds were supposed to be laughter, whispered promises, and the occasional rustling of the trees in the breeze. Instead, those places had become crime scenes. Pools of blood soaked into the dirt. Crushed car interiors where desperate hands had clawed at the doors, trying to escape. Screams swallowed by the vast, empty countryside. I never thought I would live through one of those nights. But I did. I was 19, just a kid, though I thought I was grown. Her name was Claire. I had taken her out to a movie in town, a little black and white crime thriller. Something that seemed less exciting after all the real violence we'd been hearing about. The entire town was buzzing about the murders. For people dead in the past few weeks, all of them killed in ways too gruesome to repeat in polite company. Shot in their cars. Beaten to death. Some had managed to run, but running had done them no good. And yet, I wasn't scared. Maybe I should have been. But I was young, and I had Claire beside me. That was all that mattered. After the movie, we drove out to Rich Road, a narrow, secluded stretch beyond the edge of town. A known lover's lane. The exact kind of place we should have avoided. But the danger of it felt almost exciting, a way to prove to ourselves that we weren't afraid. We parked under the towering trees, the old dirt road stretching ahead into darkness. The headlights cast long shadows before I shut them off, plunging us into the dim silver glow of moonlight filtering through the branches. Claire was nervous. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, twisting a strand of her hair between her fingers. "Maybe we should go back," she said. "Nothing's gonna happen," I reassured her. "People are just letting their imaginations get the best of them." She hesitated. Then she sighed and leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. The warmth of her breath against my neck sent a shiver down my spine. Not fear, just the kind of nervous excitement that comes from being close to someone you care about. For a while, it was just us. The distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the faint rustle of something moving in the underbrush, but probably just an animal. And then the sound. A single, sharp tap against the window. We both froze. Tap, tap. Someone, or something, was outside the car. I turned my head slowly, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The window was fogged, but through it, I saw a figure standing there, barely more than a shadow in the darkness. Tall, motionless. A white sack covered his head. 2 slits were cut for eyes, but I couldn't see anything behind them. Then the gun. It was pointed straight at my face. The next few moments were a blur. I barely had time to react before the driver's side door wrenched open. A rough, gloved hand grabbed me by the collar and yanked me out onto the dirt. I hit the ground hard, my head slamming against the gravel. Stars exploded in my vision. Claire screamed. The Phantom turned toward her. I saw the gun shift in his grip. Pure terror surged through me, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I lunged at him, trying to grab his arm, his gun, anything. A deafening crack split the night. The gun fired. The shot missed me by inches, sending dirt flying beside my face. I scrambled backward, hands clawing at the ground, trying to get away. Claire sobbed in the car. Please, please don't hurt us. The phantom didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring at me, the barrel of his gun lowering slightly. Then he turned his attention back to Claire. I knew what would happen if I let him get closer to her. I had heard the stories. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaking so hard they barely held me up. Blood ran down my cheek, where I'd scraped it against the rocks. I had no weapon, no way to fight, but I had to do something. Hey, I shouted. You want someone? Take me. The phantom tilted his head slightly, like he was considering it. Then he started walking toward me. I ran. The second I turned, I heard his boots crunch against the dirt behind me. I sprinted down the narrow road, lungs burning. The trees blurred past, the branches overhead forming a dark tunnel that swallowed me whole. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. A gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past my ear. I veered left, crashing through the underbrush, branches slashing at my face and arms. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. Behind me, I heard his footsteps. Steady, unhurried. He wasn't running. He didn't have to. He knew the woods better than I did. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning. Then a root caught my foot. I went down hard, tumbling through the dirt, leaves, and brambles. The world spun. Pain exploded through my side. I tried to get up. I couldn't. The footsteps stopped. I turned my head. The phantom stood at the edge of the clearing, his white mask glowing in the moonlight. His gun was at his side now, almost as if he had decided he didn't need it anymore. I lay there, helpless, gasping for breath. And then, a sound in the distance. A car engine. The phantom's head snapped toward the road. He listened for a moment, perfectly still. Then, without a word, he stepped backward into the shadows. I blinked. He was gone. Just like that. I don't remember getting back to town. I don't remember stumbling onto the road, waving my arms wildly until the headlights of a passing truck stopped in front of me. Claire was found curled up in the front seat of my car, sobbing. He hadn't touched her, hadn't even hurt her. Maybe he had been planning to, or maybe he had just wanted to scare us. Either way, we were lucky. Many others weren't. The phantom struck again. More couples were found dead, some shot, others beaten beyond recognition. The police hunted him for months, but he vanished. No fingerprints, no witnesses who could describe him. To this day, they don't know who he was. But I do. Not his name, not his face. But I know what he felt like, the cold, silent presence of death watching from the shadows. And some nights, when the wind is still and the moon is bright, I swear I can still feel him. Waiting, watching. I never thought I would make it out of Jonestown alive. Even now, decades later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, my heart pounding, the echoes of those last moments playing in my mind. The sounds of people screaming, of mothers pleading, of children crying, of death itself wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. I was one of the lucky ones. Or maybe not. Maybe surviving was the cruelest fate of all. Because I am the one left behind, carrying the weight of the dead, the weight of nearly 1,000 souls who never made it out. But I am getting ahead of myself. I should start from the beginning. I was only 21 when I first heard about Jim Jones. At the time, I was living in San Francisco, feeling lost and uncertain about my future. The world was changing fast, and I didn't know where I belonged. The People's Temple seemed like a beacon of hope. They preached equality, love, and unity, things I desperately wanted to believe in. Jim Jones had a way of making you feel like you were special. When he spoke, it was like he could see into your soul, as if he knew your fears and doubts and could take them all away. He promised us a better world, a utopia where we would all be safe, loved, and equal. And I believed him. So when he announced that we were leaving for Guyana to build our paradise in the jungle, I didn't hesitate. I packed my bags and left everything behind. I wasn't alone. Hundreds of others made the same choice. We called ourselves a family, bound together by faith and hope. Jonestown was supposed to be our heaven on earth. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. At first, Jonestown seemed like a dream. The jungle was alive with color and sound, the air thick with the scent of earth and rain. We built our homes, worked the fields, and gathered in the pavilion to hear Jones preach about our glorious future. But slowly, things began to change. Jones became paranoid. He spoke of enemies lurking in the shadows, of conspiracies against us. He told us that America wanted to destroy us, that the government would come to take us away, to kill us. We had to be ready to defend ourselves. Armed guards patrolled the settlement. We were cut off from the outside world. Letters home were censored, and anyone who spoke against Jones was punished. People disappeared, taken to the medical unit for re-education. Some never returned. We were always tired, always hungry. The promised paradise had turned into a prison, but by then, there was no way out. Everything changed on November 17, 1978. That was the day Congressman Leo Ryan arrived. He had heard rumors that people were being held against their will in Jonestown. He wanted to see for himself. Jones welcomed him with open arms, smiling for the cameras, pretending that all was well. We were told to put on a show, to smile and say we were happy. And most of us did. But not everyone. That night, some people slipped notes to Ryan's team, desperate messages begging for help. Please get me out. They won't let us leave. The next day, as Ryan prepared to leave, more people came forward. Families, mothers with children, men who had lost all hope. They wanted to go home. Jones was furious. He tried to convince them to stay, but they wouldn't listen. In the end, Ryan agreed to take them with him. We watched as they walked toward the airstrip, toward freedom, but they never made it. I wasn't there when the shooting started, but I heard about it later from the few who survived. As Ryan and his group prepared to board their planes, a truck arrived carrying armed men from Jonestown. Without warning, they opened fire. Ryan was killed. So were several journalists and defectors. Some managed to run into the jungle, but most were gunned down on the tarmac. Back in Jonestown, we didn't know what had happened yet. We only knew that Jones had called an emergency meeting at the pavilion. His voice rang out over the loudspeakers, summoning us all. I will never forget the look in his eyes when I arrived. He knew it was over. Jones stood before us, his voice calm but urgent. He told us that the government would come now, that they would kill us all, that there was only one way out. Revolutionary suicide. At first, people hesitated. There were murmurs, confused looks. Then the vats appeared, large containers filled with a dark, purple liquid. Poison. The first to go were the children. Parents were ordered to give them the poison first. Some resisted, but the guards were there, watching. There was no escape. I saw mothers crying as they held their babies close, whispering prayers as they forced the liquid down their throats. I heard the screams as the poison took effect, as tiny bodies convulsed and went still. And then it was our turn. People drank willingly. Others had it forced down their throats. Some tried to run but were shot. The air was filled with cries of pain, of terror, of despair. Bodies lay everywhere, the ground soaked in death. I don't know why they didn't see me. Maybe they thought I had already taken the poison. Maybe they didn't care anymore. I fell to the ground, pretending to be dead, my body pressed against the dirt, my face hidden beneath another's arm. I stayed there for hours, listening as the voices around me grew quieter, as the jungle swallowed the last of the sound. When I finally dared to open my eyes, Jonestown was silent. I don't remember how I got out. I must have run through the jungle, my feet bleeding, my mind broken. Rescue teams arrived days later, but there was nothing left to save. Over 900 people lay dead, their bodies left to rot under the sun. I was one of the few who made it out, but I didn't feel lucky. Even now, decades later, I can still hear their voices. I can still see their faces. I survived Jonestown, but a part of me never left.